Hey everybody, welcome to the OMG Tarot podcast. Thanks for bearing with me last week. I'm feeling a lot better now. So I'm back with what I at least think is an interesting topic to dive into this week. But first, I want to talk about that digital product that I dropped because you might be interested in it, and I was teasing it on the last 2 episodes. So what is it? It's an ebook, and it's called A Year of Moons. It's 24 tarot spreads, each of which is for a new moon or a full moon. So because throughout the year, we have 12 moon cycles, and sometimes, depending on the way the calendar year falls, we might end up with, say, like a 13th moon or something like that, but generally, there are 12 cycles, and those cycles go through the 12 signs of the zodiac. So the moon, just like every other planet in astrology, transits all 12 signs. So in this book, we've got a spread for each of those transits. So new moon in Aries, full moon in Libra, new moon in Taurus, so on and so forth. There aren't dates attached to these transits because I wanted this book to be a resource that you could use year after year. We're about to have a new moon in Aries. Well, actually, we just came off a full moon in Libra. But in any case, we're going to have another new moon in Aries next year and the year after that. So rather than making this specific to 2026 and the beginning of 2027, kind of that whole astrological year of Aries season to Pisces season, I wanted to make it work for every year. So if you're interested, check it out. It's over on my website, omgtarot.com/shop, and you'll see it right there. It's called A Year of Moons. And yes, there's a discount code. It's Uranus Pluto, so you'll get 20% off. Grab it, enjoy it, and if you do, let me know what you think. So this week, we're getting into those 4 figures in the corners of the Wheel of Fortune and the World cards. I've talked about them a bit in the respective episodes for those cards, but I want to go a little bit deeper with them. The most common explanation of who are these 4 figures, and the 4 figures I'm talking about are if you're using a Rider Waite Smith deck, or honestly a lot of other very similar decks, so perhaps one based on it, or even a Thoth or a Hermetic deck, which we're going to get into, take a look at the figures in the 4 corners. We've got a bull, a lion, an eagle, and a guy. The most common explanation of who are these figures is that they represent the 4 fixed signs of the zodiac. Those fixed signs are Taurus, the bull, Leo, the lion, Scorpio, the eagle, and Aquarius, the guy. See how those last 2 are are they really fitting? Well, that's because it's a little more complicated than that. And in short, yes, they do represent the 4 fixed signs, but it's nuanced, it's layered, and they don't overtly represent these. So what I mean is, these actually are a reference to the 4 living creatures mentioned in the book of Ezekiel. But in being that reference, they're also a reference to the 4 evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and in turn, they're also a reference to the 4 fixed signs, because what we're looking at is an example of iconography, and that's the use of specific symbols in art to communicate broader ideas. So, for example, those 4 evangelists, the authors of the 4 Gospels, are often represented by these 4 icons, the eagle, the lion, the bull, and the person. And because the zodiac goes back further than the New Testament and those 4 authors, we have these 4 fixed signs as kind of cultural roots, so to speak, or images that communicate ideas about our world and our connection to the cosmos that then got mapped onto newer religious traditions and newer ways of experiencing spirituality. So I guess in short, none of the interpretations are necessarily wrong, but I think it's kind of cool how they build on each other, and that's what we're going to get into today, because iconography communicates a lot of ideas, but then also we have to take a look at how did various tarot artists over the centuries choose to work with this iconography, and what does it actually mean in your deck? And then also, why is Scorpio an eagle? We've talked about that on the pod before, but to recap, the eagle is part of Scorpio's journey, so as you know, Scorpio is the sign most associated with transformation, and I like to use the analogy, think about when the scorpion molts, its exoskeleton comes off, and a brand new scorpion emerges. That's basically that sign's energy. The eagle fits into the story because the eagle represents the evolved version of Scorpio. Now, this is the only sign where we have two different symbols for two different stages of its journey. I personally think that's because Scorpio does the most transformation. That, sure, we have unevolved Aries and Virgos and all those guys, but Virgo keeps on being a maiden. Aries keeps on being a ram. Scorpio stops being a scorpion and becomes an eagle, or in some cases, a phoenix. But there's also a bit more to it, because let's take a look up at the sky and really see where the ancients were finding these zodiac signs and working them into human mythology and lore. Without getting too sidetracked, let's take a look at Scorpius, the constellation from which we get the zodiac sign Scorpio. Within this constellation, there's a star called Taurus, and this is the brightest star in that constellation. So being the brightest star, that's the one that drew the most attention, and this star has kind of a reddish hue, and that got it its name, Taurus, which I might not be pronouncing right, I'm probably not, but in any case, translates to rival of Aries, because this reddish-colored star was kind of considered, hey, kind of looks like Mars. Okay, we've got a rival to Aries. And then, what planet traditionally rules Scorpio? Also Mars. So you can kind of think of these guys, they're both that Martian energy, that penetrating, bellicose, we're going to change it, we're going to transform it. I know I've said it on the pod before, I'll say it again. A lot of modern astrologers consider Aries to be the daytime representation of Mars energy, and Scorpio to be the nighttime representation of it. And then, of course, later on, Scorpio got associated with Pluto, so it's one of those signs with two rolling planets, but that's how the ancients assigned Mars to Scorpio. The ancients also considered Taurus to be associated with an eagle because it's bright, it casts quite a bit of light across the sky, and due to its position within Scorpius, it's also known as the heart of the scorpion. So that's where we get the Scorpio-Eagle connection from. Initially, it was from the ancients seeing this particular star, the one that really gave Scorpio its lifeblood, being associated with eagles, and then as astrology and our understanding of it developed, we saw it as, hey, that's that next stage of Scorpio. That's once it's evolved, worked through its challenges, now we're soaring like an eagle. But then, what about the guy? Why is Aquarius just a guy? Which, I guess Aquarius kind of always is just a guy, or a lady. I know it's a yang energy, so I suppose that's traditionally masculine, but I've seen Aquarius depicted plenty of times, particularly in the star card, as a woman pouring out the water. So where are his decanters? He's supposed to be Aquarius, not just some rando, right? I don't know. I wish I had a cool historical and/or esoteric reason for why Aquarius isn't depicted with his trademark water cups on these two cards, but I don't. I guess he just put them down for these cards. Because you're likely working with a Rider Waite Smith deck or a deck that's based on it, let's start there. Let's take a look at what Arthur Waite meant when he had these figures included in these two cards. I busted out my copy of the Pictorial Key to the Tarot, and here's what we find. These four figures are a direct reference to the four living creatures that are first mentioned in the Book of Ezekiel. It's a prophetic book from the Tanakh, and is also part of the Old Testament in the Christian Bible. In a really quick paraphrase, this is the story of the visions of the prophet Ezekiel, who was exiled in Babylon. It starts off with God approaching Ezekiel in a chariot throne, and this throne is being drawn by the four living creatures. Each of these four living creatures, who are also identified as cherubim, has four faces. So basically in the lore, they don't need to turn because they've got four faces each, and each face is facing a cardinal direction. But those four faces are a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle, and they also have four wings. Next to each of these creatures is a wheel within a wheel, and it's covered in eyes. So whenever you see one of those depictions online of like a biblically accurate angel that's a bunch of wheels and a bunch of eyes, that's what this is referencing. So this is where we get this concept of the four living creatures being associated with God. Later on in the story, God warns that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed and a bunch of the people living there are going to experience a ton of hardships. And then the story concludes with the building of a new city and that the Jewish exile comes to an end and the new temple is built and the people now have a newer, better place to live going forward. I know that's a very extreme paraphrase, so if you want the full story, please go read it yourself. But really, I just wanted to focus on where are we getting this imagery from of these four-faced cherubim that have the lion, the ox, the person, and the eagle. That's where. And then with this as a prophetic text in the Jewish and then later Christian traditions, we see these images referenced elsewhere. We see them referenced in the Zohar, which was a Kabbalistic foundational text, and we also see it referenced in the Book of Revelation, which is a later Christian apocalyptic text. So as far as iconography goes, we now have this type of imagery as kind of a visual shorthand for God's presence and God being here as you experience turmoil, because Ezekiel was being warned of coming turmoil. Now let's bring it back to the two cards that we're taking a closer look at. We've got the Wheel of Fortune, which is pretty chaotic. It's random stuff getting thrown your way, and it's like, hey, this wheel keeps on turning, whether you like it or not. You're just on this wheel that is the world and the universe, and you're going to have to zig when it zigs and zag when it zags, and manage all the things that life and the universe throws your way. Then we've got the world, and we similarly have this idea of completion and reaching the end of something. I do think it's worthwhile to mention here that the planet associated with the world card is Saturn. And remember what we talked about in a previous episode about Saturn signs? How Saturn used to be the end of our astronomical neighborhood. The ancients only identified planets up to Saturn, so Saturn became associated with endings and closure. In ancient times, Saturn was the god of the harvest, and we still see a lot of references to that in earlier tarot decks that depict death with a scythe and really kind of lean into this Saturnian energy. But reaching that ending that we see in the world card, that wasn't just handed to you. That was something that you worked hard for, and now, only after all the trials that the Fool faced on his journey, can he move on to the next cycle and really feel good about, okay, everything that I've done, it's done. It's in the past. Now we're ascending, graduating upward, going someplace else to start a new cycle. Now, I'm not sure if this is a coincidence or not. Probably not. I don't think there are any coincidences in tarot, but both of these cards have this sense of a wheel to them, like literally the Wheel of Fortune. And then, oh, what was right beside both of the four living creatures? Wheels. Wheels upon wheels. Wheels within wheels. Wheels with lots of eyes. What we do also have from Arthur Waite is an explanation that the presence of these figures shows that divinity and providence is there as you're going through the trials. So yeah, you might draw the Wheel of Fortune, and you might feel like chaos is happening, but those four figures are there to assure you that no matter what, God, your chosen deity, whatever is out there protecting you, is continuing to hold your hand and protect you through it. I think that's a nice message, and I also think that to particularly a lot of modern readers, it might be a little surprising to see just how much Judeo-Christian mythology and ideas are baked into this deck. And I always want to remind you to think about, who was this created for? Who was the audience that this was made for? Well, it was created for Western audiences who largely were Christian and would have been familiar with a lot of this sort of iconography. There are other decks that deliberately strip away that iconography and find stuff either from other cultures or even just create their own imagery to communicate certain universal ideas. Take a look through your collection of decks. I just did that to kind of get some ideas and pull up some images for this episode, and I found a lot that referenced the four elements or the zodiac signs from the Rider Waite Smith, and then I also found a bunch that didn't. Some Wheels of Fortune are literally just a wheel, and a lot seem to lean into like gambling imagery, which I thought was interesting because that's a bit of a departure from the original depictions of this card. One in particular to shout out is the Deviant Moon, which I've always loved this deck. It's a great deck. It really takes a bit of a departure from how Pamela Coleman Smith initially illustrated it, which, fair, that's fine, because also these 4 figures are only on the Wheel of Fortune in the Pamela Coleman Smith version and moving forward. Take a look at a Marseille-style deck. You're not going to see them. You will see the figures on the world, and we're going to get back into that, but adding them to the Wheel of Fortune is a bit more of a modern thing. Now, one other thing you might be wondering is, okay, how about in the Toth deck? Did Crowley choose to include these? The answer is yes. Yes, he did. And he makes the same exact reference that Waite makes in saying, yeah, these are a reference to the 4 living creatures from the Book of Ezekiel and then later the Book of Revelation. So let's take a look back in some tarot history to see, where did artists start depicting these cards this way? Well, taking a look at any pre-Rider Waite Smith deck, you'll notice that for the most part, the Wheel of Fortune is depicted a lot more literally. It's a wheel, and there's often people trying to stand on it, probably falling off it, and sometimes instead of people, they're figures. So that's really where this card got its start. It still had that meaning of life is going to bring its good times and bad times, and all you can really do is kind of roll with it. As you can see from people, some of them are successfully standing on it, others not so much. With the World card, we have a little bit more of a direct lineage of this type of imagery. Let's take a look at the Tarot de Marseille, because in a lot of ways that inspired our more modern decks. And now, quick caveat here. Let's talk about the Tarot de Marseille and what do I actually mean when I'm referring to it, because there's the Tarot de Marseille, which is a very specific design. It's a particular design that was mostly popular in France and Italy during the 17th and 18th centuries. It's also still in print today. You could go to your local mystical shop and get a brand new copy of the Tarot de Marseille. However, then you might hear me reference something called a Marseille-style deck. These are decks that are similar to the Tarot de Marseille in that they have an illustrated major arcana, but a non-illustrated minor arcana. That's where the similarities end. Some Marseille-style decks do have that old-school woodcut style design, one of which I have on my desk right now is the Tarot di Piacentini, but some are way different. The Tarot of the Drowning World is a modern example of a Marseille-style deck in that, as I mentioned, only the majors have pictures. The minors look like playing cards. So that's the difference. You're going to hear Tarot de Marseille, that's a specific deck, Marseille-style deck, similar to the Tarot de Marseille. Now, bringing it back to the World card, I think there's some really cool history here that inspired the Tarot de Marseille. This card can trace its imagery back to 15th century Italian playing cards called trionfi. Trionfo is the Italian word for triumph, and then trionfi means triumphs. It's the plural version. This is also where we get the English phrase trump card, which, if you're not a card player, basically a trump card is a more powerful card than the others in the game. So if you have a trump card in your hand, depending on the game, they all have slightly different rules, but basically that's a super valuable resource in your hand. Anyway, these trionfi, which there are 6 of them, were initially used in tarot games, and they were based on a series of poems that were already about 100 years old when they were illustrated by the Italian poet Petrarch. Now, thinking back to English class, if you studied Petrarch, you might know a bit about his love for that woman Laura and how he pines for her, wants her, all of that stuff, and eventually ends up wishing that they could spend eternity together in heaven. These 6 triumphi illustrations depict the triumphant processions of 6 allegorical figures: love, chastity, death, fame, time, and eternity. And the way that they're arranged is they're basically a series, so each one kind of supersedes the next. So we have love, and then chastity kind of takes over and triumphs over love. but then death triumphs over chastity, and so on and so forth until we reach eternity, the last one. And this is where we see the design cues for our modern world card. The image shows God seated at the middle of the card, surrounded by a ring of angels, a lot like how on the world card we have that figure surrounded by that wreath. So we have this imagery of the main figure in the middle with a ring around them, and then out at the four corners we have these four figures. On the eternity image, the corners have saints ministering to the four living creatures from the book of Ezekiel. And in it, more similar to the modern Wheel of Fortune, which I find interesting, they're all reading books, which just to go back to the Wheel of Fortune, I think it's a little interesting and ironic that our four figures that, hey, are they supposed to represent chaos and the end times here? They're sitting nicely and reading books. If anything, the Wheel of Fortune would kind of be a nice poster to put up in the library, I think. It's like, read. These four guys are doing it. So, all right, we've got a pretty firm establishment that the four figures in these cards are references to the four living creatures from the book of Revelation. So then where are you getting the four evangelists and the four zodiac signs and, as some readers say, the four archangels? Well, let's get into it. We can trace the iconography of these four figures corresponding with the four evangelists back to early Christian times. The figure perhaps best known for really putting this iconography into writing is Saint Jerome. It's important to note that he wasn't the first Christian scholar to use this iconography. That honor goes to a man named Irenaeus, who was a Greek bishop who lived during the 2nd century. But back to Saint Jerome. He was a Christian scholar who lived about 350-ish years after Christ died, so not exactly a contemporary of the very earliest Christians, but definitely within that first wave, so to speak. Or, for him, Christianity was not particularly old. But it was also old enough to be established, and he's best known for translating the Bible into Latin. In his writing, St. Jerome identified the figures that Ezekiel saw pulling God's chariot as prophetic of the four Gospels. Remember, the book of Ezekiel predates the Gospels. When St. Jerome wrote this, he was drawing upon what was already an established piece of iconography. I also think it's kind of interesting to look at throughout history. Different scholars have assigned different figures to different evangelists, but the most widely accepted lineup, if you will, is that Matthew is represented by the angel, Mark is represented by the lion, Luke is represented by the ox, and John is represented by the eagle. Fun fact, when all four of these are depicted together in art, it's known as a tetramorph. Following St. Jerome's writing, tetramorphs became popular in Christian art. You'll see them a whole lot throughout medieval art and even later art, and you'll also see the individual icons in evangelist portraits, so take a look through art history. It's actually, I think art history is a really cool kind of adjacent study to reading tarot cards because on the one hand, you're kind of thinking in that same iconography kind of way, and in another, there are so many references to concepts and ideas that you're going to see in historical art showing up in your tarot deck. So, those four fixed zodiac signs. Keep in mind that when Ezekiel saw God showing up in his chariot pulled by these four living creatures, he was in exile. Where? In Babylon. This is where Western astrology originated. Using these four fixed signs to represent the four living creatures and then later the four evangelists is an example of cultural syncretism. This is where one culture, or in this case, one religion, it happens both culturally, religiously, and often the two are intertwined, takes images and symbolism from one and mixes it with another and kind of reworks and reconfigures. We have so many examples of this happening throughout history, so this is absolutely nothing novel or new. When viewed on the zodiac wheel, These 4 fixed signs create what's known as the fixed cross. This is because literally if you plot them all on a wheel, they show up in a pattern that looks like a cross, and perhaps this is why early Christians adopted this symbolism. It's also relevant to note that it's the 4 fixed signs, not the cardinal or mutable signs, and this can represent the stability and the cyclical nature of the year. So this idea that no matter what, we're living in cycles, and we can trust that maybe, looking over to which cards we're dealing with, the Wheel of Fortune, it's chaos, it's craziness, it's also a bit of a reminder that nothing's forever, that we're all going through cycles, so perhaps you're going through a challenging time, it's going to end. Perhaps you're going through a great time, unfortunately, it'll end eventually. So enjoy the good times, deal with the bad times, and just recognize that, again, that symbolism of the wheel, cycling and cycling and cycling, you're just riding this great bus known as life. And then the world, similarly, we've got that idea of trustworthy cycles. You've reached the end of this cycle, and it's time to go into the next one. So that's something, if nothing else, every cycle might have different plot points and different ideas, but you can always trust in that cyclical nature because that part is fixed. So that's why I say that all of the interpretations of who are these 4 figures, be it the 4 living creatures, the evangelists, or the zodiac signs, they're kind of all right because they're all representing each other. It's kind of like, yeah, this is Scorpio, and it's symbolic of John the Evangelist, and it's a reference to the 4-faced creature that Ezekiel saw in the book of Ezekiel. It's all of those things. I think most tarot readers primarily subscribe to the zodiac sign interpretation, and I think that's because so much astrology is just baked into the deck that it's very easy to see, oh, okay, this is more references to signs. This makes sense. There's another interpretation of who these 4 figures are, and it's that they represent 4 of the archangels. These angels are figures from early Jewish and Christian literature that serve God directly. From what I've read supporting this theory, it seems like there's not a whole ton of agreement around which figure is which archangel. I found some contradictory stuff, but it seems like generally the agreement is that the eagle represents Uriel, the lion represents Raphael, the bull is Michael, and the angel is Gabriel. Each of these speaks to various qualities, and these qualities align with the qualities typically associated with the zodiac signs that we also see represented here. So, for example, the archangel Raphael, who is symbolized by the lion, tends to symbolize joy, kindness. I think a lot of those really charismatic, gregarious traits that we often associate with Leo. Another interesting interpretation that I saw for this archangel understanding is that while the 4 figures are, yes, they're references to the evangelists, they're also kind of secondarily references to the archangels, and that overall, this is all to symbolize that as you're going through it, you've got divine presence. You've got that protection because that's what the archangels are here for. They're here to protect humans, I guess serve as a liaison with God. And I guess I say I guess because I don't know a whole ton about them, but I'm going to dive in more. I think next week we might talk about angel symbolism in tarot because there are a number of angels in this deck. There's the one on Temperance, there's the one on Judgment, there's the one on the Lovers. We're going to talk about them. Which brings me to a question that I have for you, listeners. Do you like these more research-heavy academic episodes, or are you not really into them? I really would like to know because honestly, I kind of like these. I really enjoyed doing this research and going in more of this academic direction. But if you're not into it, I want to give you episodes that you're into. So if you're more interested in episodes that deal strictly with handling the cards, reading the cards, all of that stuff, I can do that. Or I know some of you have been really digging on the astrology stuff. If you want more of that, let me know. This is never going to turn into the OMG Astrology podcast, but if that's something that you really like hearing about, that's definitely an avenue I can go down. I'm also always open to suggestions for topics to explore, so if you have something on your mind that you think would make a good podcast episode, send it my way. That's how we got the one about the aces. Well, how do you send it my way? There's a couple of ways. You can email it to me, where my email address is omg@omgtarot.com. You can also DM me. I'm on Instagram, and my handle is its_omg_tarot. So, you got ideas? DM them. You can also just drop it as a comment here on Spotify, or if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, I think they can leave comments over there. I don't know. Just know that if you're a Spotify listener and you drop a comment, I'm going to see it a lot faster because that's what I use. I check Apple every now and then, but I'm using Spotify for creators. Honestly, though, email or DM is probably the fastest, best way to get in touch with me. So yeah, do that. And if you're interested in some cool tarot spreads that correlate with the new and full moons throughout the year, check out A Year of Moons. It's out, it's available, and you can get it for 20% off with the promo code UranusPluto. So that's about all I have for you today. As always, thank you so much for listening. I hope you learned something interesting today. I know I sure did as I was researching this episode, and I will catch you next time where we're going to talk about angels in the tarot deck. All right, catch you soon. Bye-bye.